My name is Mordecai Dzikansky, the author of Terrorist Cop, and actually coming out with a textbook in October called Terrorist Suicide Bombing. What I'd like to start with today is to share with you how in 1983, on January 3rd, I never in my life expected to write, first off, Terrorist Cop, and then a textbook, Terrorist Suicide Bombings. I never thought this would happen. And the best way I could take you through that experience of how I got to that stage is to tell you 4 separate titles I originally thought about my memoir that will sort of explain how I got to Terrorist Cop. The first one is Accidental Cop. My grandfather was a Rosh Yeshiva in Slobodka. For people who are aware, there was a tremendous yeshiva in Lithuania. My father was a rabbi at Yeshiva University for 45 years, and I'm a yeshiva graduate. Unfortunately, it took 8 separate yeshivas till I officially graduated. And I'm proud to say in this audience, it makes it very special, one of them was Yeshiva Crown Heights. And actually, I don't even think they asked me to leave, but we were at 310 Crown Street, and next door was Pesach, where I spent a lot of money. So I'm very connected to the community. And I was a camper at Holy Torah Day Camp. So that actually is a nice segue into how I got there. In 1983, I became the 3rd Orthodox cop and the 3rd yarmulke-wearing cop. First one was Harvey Hecker in 1981, who started out in Crown Heights. The second one was Gary Moskowitz, who worked in the city in 1982. And of course, they realized how well it segued in Crown Heights. I would actually start my career in Crown Heights in 1983. It was a wonderful experience there, and actually one of the best of my career. I got there, and I had a home on Kingston Avenue, had all the food I needed, all the friends I needed, and back then I had high crime. A cop wants to be busy, and that was a perfect area to learn my trade craft, to be a cop, but yet be able to relax into Kingston Avenue. Now, one of the best stories, or one of the most wonderful experiences, was telling my father in 1983 that I was on the corner of Kingston and Eastern Parkway, and everyone knows Thursday nights, the Rebbe Zichrono Livracha used to have his Farbrengen. And I mentioned to one of the local store owners, it'd be great if I got a dollar that's blessed. So I'm standing there on the corner of Kingston Eastern Parkway. It's about 10 o'clock at night, and I'm working with police officer Victoria Garcia. Obviously not a lanceman or lancewoman. I mean, however we would describe him, obviously not a member of our tribe. And I'm standing on the corner, and I'm wearing a hat. Now, everyone there knew I was the Orthodox cop. And about 10, 11 o'clock at night, and I forget his name now, and I'll call him Moshe. All of a sudden, Moshe is running out of 770 on the corner, and he's waving a dollar bill at me. And he says, "Here, Morty, I got this for you." And I'm looking, and I'm saying, okay, how do I explain this to police officer Victoria Garcia at the holiness of this dollar? So all of a sudden, he gives me a dollar, and I'm going like, not now, not now, not now. But, he was insistent, this is for you, and he gave it to me. So I had to explain the significance behind the dollar. And the way I ended it, I thought was perfect. I said, listen, my usual bribe is at least 20. So I said, this cop is not for sale for $1. So this was a wonderful segue in terms of that. Now, back then I considered myself to be the accidental cop. New York City had actually changed the law for civil service. Of course, the big prohibition of somebody Orthodox becoming a cop was that the civil service test to become a police officer was given on Saturdays. So obviously, if you can't take the test on a Saturday, you can't become a cop. Well, they changed the law. And again, I'd be the 3rd person to be able to benefit from them changing the law. And everything else sort of had to be worked out in terms of your schedule, not working Friday nights, not working Saturdays. But the first obstacle was taking the test. And the test was given on Fridays, took the test, passed it, and I started out in Crown Heights. Now comes the biggest career move for every cop. It is what we call the permanent assignment, which means in theory, you could spend, of course, police back then was a 20-year career, and you spend 20 years as a policeman. You could end up in one neighborhood or one area for that entire 20 years. Well, they already had a firm guy in Crown Heights, Harvey Hecker, and they wanted to distribute the wealth, as we say. And the other area where they were going to distribute was going to be Borough Park. Now, I'm 20 years old, not the most mature 20-year-old at the time. So the concept of sending me to Borough Park was not exactly my idea of what I wanted. I wanted to go to the city. I said the city, the Big Apple, Times Square, boy chicks, kosher pizza, crime. I got it made. I have everything. Okay. So I figured this is perfect. And I tell them I want to go to the city. I mean, you're turning down Borough Park? You're not accepting Borough Park? I said, in plain English, yeah. Well, I'm a first generation. Like I said, my father, grandfather, Rebbeim. So I know how protocols were Rebbeim, but obviously not with the police department what protocol is. Well, they said, well, if you don't want Borough Park, we have a great neighborhood for you. Where? Bedford-Stuyvesant. Now, back then, the expression for Bedford-Stuyvesant was do or die in Bed-Stuy. And I'll tell you the truth, it actually earned its name. Again, I had no idea where this was. They said, oh, it's on the other side of Eastern Parkway. Interesting enough, it was a great segue for me. I went to work in steady midnights, yarmulke on, never had to work Friday night or Shabbos. It was a wonderful entrance to the police department. But I sort of normally get my way, and about a year and a half later, I get transferred into the city. Now, again, I'm the accidental cop. I am willing to take that contract, the imaginary contract, and say, you know what? For the next 20 years or 18 years I have left in the police department, I will work in Midtown Manhattan. I have food. You know, I was single then, so I had, stern girls, I guess I could say. So I had a little bit of exposure to everything then. Well, I get this infamous call in 1985. Police Officer Dzikansky? I go, yes. You're on a list of 20 people who speak Hebrew in the New York City Police Department. We've interviewed 19. So far, all we have are bar and bat mitzvah graduates. That's the extent of it. They go, if we need somebody to say the Haftorah, we're set. But I am probably the only person in the world to say, thank God for Israeli drug dealers, because they had this tremendous investigation involving Israeli drug dealers that was based in Colombia, New York, and Israel. And they needed somebody who was A, a police officer, and B, was semi-fluent in Hebrew. Well, back then, I was their man. And it worked out great. So now, I'm transferred into the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. Again, I'm like 23 years old. I'm given a brand new car, credit cards, and I'm like Don Johnson from Miami Vice. Actually, that's a great fit for me, Miami Vice. It makes sense, land of my people. This would be perfect. And I am a very, very happy camper. So, okay. Now we have said I am the accidental cop. I had a wonderful experience in Crown Heights. I had a wonderful experience in Bedford-Stuyvesant. That was pretty good. I had a good experience in narcotics. I'm set. My next title that I was thinking of after accidental cop was accidental detective. Again, I am a first generation. I don't know how it is to become a detective. I don't know what detectives do. All I know is Telly Savalas eats a lollipop. That's it. That's my extent of my knowledge of detective work, in terms of what it leads to. So I finished narcotics, have a great experience there, and where do I get sent to again? And again, my goal, for whatever reason, is always to get to Midtown Manhattan. I don't know whether it was to get to 47th Street or what it was, but it was to get to Midtown Manhattan. And where did they send me to again? Bedford-Stuyvesant. So now I'm back as the accidental detective in Bedford-Stuyvesant. It seemed like that was always my penance. I had to do a year there till I really appreciated what I have. Well, I did a year there. Great experience again. But all of a sudden, I play my magic. and I end up back in Midtown as a robbery detective. Now, I am ecstatic. Remember that first contract that I had where I said if I'm a patrolman in uniform, I will sign it for 20 years, or 18 years at that point? Well, this new contract is even better, because now I'm in plain clothes, or even a suit and tie. Now I'm working in Midtown Manhattan. Nothing could have reached a higher level in terms of my expectations or my joy in what I was doing. So, I am set. This is the accidental detective signing his contract. I'm in. Well, we have two titles so far. We have accidental cop, first generation, possibly last generation NYPD. We have accidental detective, loving my job in Midtown Manhattan as a robbery detective, which meant plain clothes, long hair, and like chasing bad guys, which I really wanted to do. And I'm set. Now, my third title for all the NYPD Blue fans, the show NYPD Blue, was NYPD Jew. Now, you might ask, why NYPD Jew? First and foremost, it was an absolute favorite. It was a scary favorite in my office. If you called my office on Tuesday night at 10 p.m., the phone would ring for 2 hours until somebody picked up because we were all watching NYPD Blue. Now, I was very happy because I'm one of the few cops who actually has an episode sort of done after him, which was my Torah cases, which I'll talk about afterwards, where Sipowicz dressed up as a Chassid and he chased the Torah thief. Well, only one person ever did that in NYPD history, and that's me. So I had this, mazel, if you want to say, of actually having an episode done for him. But the true essence of NYPD Jew for me happened in 1990. I believe it was November 4th, if I'm not mistaken, when Rabbi Kahane was murdered. I was working that evening, and again, up to that point, my use in terms of the police department was my language skills. They knew I knew Hebrew. They used me for narcotics. I probably would have made a very good poster child for them, being that, I looked sort of like a cop in the yarmulke. Everything was good. But the NYPD didn't take advantage, if you want to say it that way, of my background. Well, that night when Rabbi Kahane was, I don't even use the word murder. This was a terrorist murder. When he was assassinated that evening, I was working, and it just so happened to happen literally 10 blocks from my precinct where I'm officially assigned. So I was brought in from the onset of this investigation. Just from the very beginning, I was brought in. Now again, I had grown up in the frum community. I was very well aware of the activities of the JDL and the Soviet fight, but I also was very well aware of him forming Kach, becoming a member of the Knesset, being expelled from the Knesset, knowing all the particulars involved with Rabbi Kahane. And again, I said, I was brought in, quote unquote, because this is the rabbi's son who happens to be a detective in Midtown. And I ended up telling the chief that evening, or the chief who was working, this is not for JDL. This has nothing to do with an anti-Semitic. This is a terrorist hit. This has totally involving terrorism. It is Islamic terrorism, which is very clear. It has every ingredient. I didn't need to know that the murderer's name was Nosir, because I would have said it was Muhammad something. It was clear and obvious that this was an Islamic hit. I hate to say I was right, and we all know I was right that evening, but unfortunately back then, the NYPD wasn't, as I say, built to conduct these sort of investigations. When I say built, meaning we were very good at catching robbers, we were very good at catching murderers, we were very good at catching drug dealers, but we really could not look at what was the big picture. A was capability. B was we didn't feel this was our responsibility, because that's what Big Brother's for. That's what the FBI is for, that's what the CIA is for, that's what the military is for, that's for all the other organizations other than a municipal local police department, which is really what we are. So, fortunately, unfortunately, I turned out to be right that night, and I had established myself at this point the kid does know what he's talking about. And back then I was a kid, despite the gray hair now. It was 1990, so it was back in the day. And at this stage, I would be called upon by the NYPD, not only for, anything above bar and bar mitzvah lessons, but even to the stage of anything involving the Jewish community. And what ended up happening during that period, I was also brought in for the Ari Havisham murder, which again had every earmark of a terrorist assassination. And we all knew it back then. In 1994, we were a little bit better at it. We were still good at chasing down the murderer, but looking at the big picture and calling what I hate to say is a spade, we weren't really equipped for that. So now we have two books. We have Accidental Cop, Accidental Detective, and NYPD Jew. So we're up to 3. Now, this is what I figured to be my entire career. Where else are we going to go? Now, the 4th title, which I never even imagined ever, was From Torah to Terror. Again, not too many people put those 2 words in the same sentence, but my career went from Torah to terror. In 1992, 1993, there was a rash. When I say rash, there was over 10 shuls, synagogues, that were burglarized. Now, these were not events of anti-Semitism. There were no swastikas drawn. There was no graffiti. There was no damage. These were strictly a synagogue being burglarized, going inside, and the thief, knowing what he was doing, taking the Sifrei Torah and taking the silver. Now, again, the NYPD got so much better at putting things together in today's day and age, but back then we weren't good at knowing that what was going on in terms of the rash. Because why? It was happening in Brooklyn, it was happening in Queens, it was happening in Manhattan, it was happening in the Bronx, it was happening in different areas. And nobody was talking back then to realize that maybe we have one person or a ring of thieves stealing these Torahs. Well, thank God for JCRC, the Jewish Community Relations Council, who sort of acts as the protector of anything involving Sifrei Torah, and the Daily News. Because the next thing you know, it's a front page article saying Torah thief on the loose. So now I've already established myself as the NYPD Jew. So who's going to investigate the Torahs but Mordecai Dzikansky? Okay, so I'm brought in. I'm taken out of my permanent assignment at this point in Manhattan, in Midtown. I'm brought into homicide, and the segue there, homicide, because when we interviewed the people about the Torah thefts, we wanted to show the seriousness that the NYPD was placing on this crime. So basically to equate the theft of a Torah with the murder of a person. I worked exclusively on these investigations for 6 months, and what I was primarily trying to do, bless you, is 2 things. One is to re-interview every shul that was burglarized, seeing if there was a common denominator, because there wasn't any, CSI information or anything like that. And 2 is, where would they sell the Torahs? Obviously to farm stores or to a sofa. In other words, we had to find out. And apparently, during that 6 months, we made a strong impact. Strong impact meaning the theft stopped. And as icing on the cake, we actually caught a separate Torah thief who had stolen a Sefer Torah from upstate New York and tried to sell it in Brooklyn. So now, in terms of police work, the first thing you want to do is stop the crime, which we did. The second thing is to actually catch the person who committed a crime. Okay, it's 1995. I'm back in my old office in Midtown. I'm a happy camper. I've signed that contract and I want to stay there for as long as they'll let me. It's about 1:45 in the morning. And just to explain, I used to work night shifts and day shifts. And the night shift was from 4 in the afternoon to 1 in the morning. The day shift was from 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. Now, that particular night, it's 1:45. I have to be back in the office at 8 o'clock. So to say that I'm a little bit rushed to get home was saying it lightly. So a uniform officer comes up with this regular-looking white male, Richie Stevens, who happens to be Jewish. He had been attempting a burglary in the Waldorf Astoria. Now, if you're a Midtown detective and the name Waldorf Astoria comes off, it's like the bells ring. Ding, 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 ding. This is, Well, let me tell you something. After what I'm going to tell you, this actually segues into a perfect thing. Now, if I say doing my job robotically that evening, is actually saying it lightly. So I do what I call my Monty Hall deal, let's make a deal. And I explain to him, listen, Richie, you're facing 6 months in jail. Not a big deal. But if you know something of a bigger crime, I might be able to speak to the district attorney's office and make a deal with you. And again, it's an attempted burglary in the Waldorf Astoria. We're not talking about, Charles Manson here. We're talking about, Richie Stevens, a former school teacher. Not, nicht größer, it's nothing to get excited about other than the location. Well, he says, detective, what if I know something about those Torah thefts that happened 3 years ago? Excuse me? I didn't ask you about Torahs. How dare you speak about Torahs? It was, when I tell you the last thing that crossed my mind, that I even thought about, that I was even connected to, I'd be exaggerating. I did not think of it. Listen, the book would work out even better if I said, yeah, he smelled like stolen Torahs. Or, there was something about him, the way he looked, the way he acted. There was garnish, nothing. Nothing at all. And he just opened up and he said he knew something about Torah, the Torah thefts. So, I put 2 and 3 together. I got 6. And I realized he's got to be the Torah thief. Well, he basically confessed to all the thefts. Now, the biggest challenge now is, okay, I'm in shock. I'm in shock. I'm literally in shock. But my most important part now is getting back the safers that were stolen. And there were over 15 that were stolen. Where are they? And that's when, I don't believe in the phone books, hitting the person over the head. I basically give him a good old dose of Jewish guilt. And say, you know what? We got to get these Torahs back. And the only thing he was reluctant to do was to involve the fence. Well, before I even start talking about the fence, I'll say he only had one redeeming factor, his first name. His first name was Morty. So now Morty, the fence, was going to get caught by Morty, the detective. As we said, only New York kids, only in New York. I mean, this just doesn't happen anywhere else. So we pick up Morty the fence. And Morty the fence happens to be, a Chassid, which, is a separate, completely separate issue. And he was a silversmith on 47th Street. And obviously, after sending Richie into the shuls to steal the silver, he now sent him in not only for the silver, but the Sifrei Torah. So he's just a bad apple. This guy is strictly a bad apple. He knew what he was doing. He made all the excuses in the world, but the bottom line is he sent this guy in to steal the Sifrei Torah and the silver. Okay. So now Morty's arrested. And I have both of them, but I still don't have the Sifrei Torah. So we have the thief, we have the fence, but we want the Torahs back. It's approaching sukkahs. And negotiations, he has one of the biggest attorneys in New York City, whose initials are BB, who happens to be Orthodox. So he's a really, really great attorney.
His name Mordecai too?
No. And he was trying to help us also. In other words, he was working for his client, but he knew we had to get the Sifrei Torah back. So we made a deal. You surrender the Torahs to the district attorney's office. We're not going to ask any questions. We'll just get them back. Eventually, get them back to the shuls where they were burglarized from, and we'll take something off your sentence, your eventual time that you were supposed to spend in jail. Okay, this is Erev Sukkot, which, with Simchas Torah right around the corner, you can't get better timing than this. Not only am I doing the mitzvahs, but I'm actually probably looking at a really big promotion here. I mean, New York City, getting back Sifrei Torah for Simchas Torah, it doesn't get, at least the news conference of the New York Times article doesn't get bigger than that. Well, I get a box of Sifrei Torah. There were 15 totally together, brought to the Manhattan DA's office. And again, I have to mention the district attorney involved with this is Joel Seidman, who was one of my partners in what we call the Torah Task Force. So I am now the Torah detective. He's the Torah prosecutor. And, like I said, this is a Sipowicz story. That's how it all came about. And we get the box of Sifrei Torah in the office. And we open up the box. And we take out the first one. And we look at the Sefer. Now, this is where I will tell everybody about this program. It's called the Torah Registry. I have pamphlets up here. Halachically, accepted by everybody. It's a pinpoint method where you mark a Sefer Torah in different spots. It's sort of like having a VIN in a car. No two cars have the same number. Well, in the Sefer Torah, no two Sefer Torahs have the pinpoints in the same spot. And again, according to every pasuk I've heard, halachically, it's universal. Take out the first Torah, and it actually belongs to JTS. This is wonderful. We open up the Sefer. This is great. But now we take out Sefer Torah number 2. Sefer Torah number 3. And I don't want to say these are bogus Torahs, but they're not our Torahs. They are just anonymous Torahs without any markings whatsoever. And every other Torah in the box except for ours was the right one. Well, needless to say, we're a little bit angry. It's one thing to pull wool over your eyes. It's another thing to pull sheepskin over your eyes. I mean, this was done in a very, very, very bad taste. So now the district attorney is getting really, he goes, Morty, that's it. We're going to nail Morty, chas v'chalila, to the cross, but to the Jewish star. That's it. He's mincemeat. So what are we going to do? So now it's Chol Hamoed, and he's out on bail. He's facing a couple years in jail, which obviously he's going to get now. And Joel says, you know what? The gloves are off. No longer surrendering with the attorney, making an appointment, making sure he has his kosher food and all that. I want you to go to his house and arrest him in his house. But where does he live? He lives in Muncie. Well, obviously you understand my predicament. I'd rather go to Iraq carrying a sign, I hate the Shiites and the Sunnis, than go to Muncie on Chol Hamoed Sukkos and lock up a chassid. This doesn't really work for what I wanted to do with the NYPD. I just did not like this scenario. So I go, Joel, you're a friend and you're a respected prosecutor. I'll accept your decision, except for one thing. I'm going to go early in the morning when he's still sleeping, and we'll do it that way. He goes, I don't care what time, but we're not making an appointment. The gloves are off. You're going to arrest him in his house. Okay. So I go up to Muncie, and I bring a partner up with me and just one police car in case there's, but it's 5 in the morning, so I figured no problem. I knock, and it's Chol Hamoed. I knock on the door. His wife answers the phone. And I go, the ultimate question, where's Morty? Well, Morty's not here. And I'm saying, where did Morty go? Morty's out on bail. He cannot leave New York. He cannot basically leave his house without court permission. Where did Morty go? Well, Morty's sleeping in the sukkah. Ah, now I understand. Now I get it. So you think, who can make this up? So I go to the sukkah, and I'm looking to knock on the door, but there is no door. So I actually say, Morty, it's time to go. He goes, oh, you found out? He goes, yep, we found out. So now I take him, and again, I try not to embarrass him in front of the family, no handcuffs or nothing, but he's being brought back and rearrested for an additional charge of criminal possession of unknown Torahs. But, the prosecutor found the charge to give him, and that's it. So I bring Morty downtown, and I'm going through the arrest process, and now, back then, I like to say the police department had these forms. They're called idiot forms. Why are they idiot forms? Because there's a box, white, black, Hispanic, Indian, you name it, it's there. Time of day, everything is a box, especially location of arrest. Now, you have to be very exact. Now, I'm going through this, and I'm seeing cemetery. I'm seeing places I've never been to. Oh, there I've been. Railroad station, railroad courtyard. I'm seeing every imaginable space in the world except for the sukkah. Now, I leave it blank because I don't know what I'm going to write. And there's a nice civilian typing up my report. She looks at me. She goes, "Detective, why did you leave this blank? I expect like a uniform cop who just got out of the academy. But you're a seasoned detective now. Why are you leaving this blank?" I go, "Because it isn't there." She goes, "Well, tell me." "In the sukkah." She goes, "Huh?" I go, "One more time." I go, "In the sukkah." Now she's getting beyond curious. She's getting annoyed at me. She goes, "Detective, I'm about to put this file underneath all the others, and you're not going to hear a single, you won't see this for another 2 hours." I go, "Ma'am, where are you from?" She goes, "Williamsburg." I go, "Do you know those things where people have outside their apartments now and in their backyards?" She scratches her head and she goes, "Oh, you mean the huts?" She goes, "Don't ever say that in front of me again. You locked him up in the hut." Well, needless to say, that we still never got those back because of the registry. And again, the pamphlets are up here for shuls if you want to bring them around the country to inquire about it. Without this, we never would have been able to prove in court that, in fact, these were our Torahs. Because every single Torah Basher was a registered Torah. So, and this segues into 3 Sefer, and you ask what happened with the other 14 Sefer Torah. Well, a couple of them weren't kosher beyond repair, and a couple that were, it was just distributed, one to Bosnia, one to Bulgaria, and I actually was part of a ceremony that we just started the Sefer Torah, which is going to the USS George Washington. So there's a happy ending with the Sefer Torah also in the long run. Okay, so now I'm a happiest camper. You know, I found my mission in terms of police work. I'm being used for language. I'm being used for knowledge of the Jewish community. And I'm also being used for Torahs. Who could ask? And I did another investigation that we did recover the Sefer Torah. So I've completed what I figured, God had in mind. So now we segue to terror. September 10th, 2001. And again, I started by saying that I didn't feel terror was part of my responsibility. It was getting involved with terrorist investigations, but as a local municipal cop, murderers, robbers, burglars, drug dealers, Torah thieves, but not terrorism. Well, if I take you to that day, September 10th, I'm already moved into my next spot. Now I'm officially a homicide detective in Manhattan South, which means I covered from 59th Street down to the Battery, from one river to the other. My career cannot go better. Again, a first-generation Orthodox homicide detective. Never thought it would happen. My wife is a vice president at Lehman Brothers. Again, one of us had to earn a living, so. That's part of the problem with civil service. One of us, had to pay for eventual yeshiva tuition. So we had to figure out, how it was going to be. And everything is great. She's the vice sisterhood president of our shul. We're living in Long Beach, Long Island. Life is grand. Well, we all know what happened the next day. And it's very ironic that the anniversary is coming up, September 11th. I was off that day. My wife was at work, which back then was in the World Financial Center, which was directly across the street from the World Trade Center. And I also had an option certain days to go in and not to go in, because I was always making up Friday nights and Shabbos unless I was in the middle of a homicide investigation. And in that particular day, September 11th, I sort of woke up and said, you know what, I don't feel like going in today. I have to make up a day. My bosses trusted me. They knew I would come in, account for my time, but I wasn't going to do it that day. So I'm at home. Well, she saw the first planes go in. She barely made it out of the World Financial Center. I mean, she was smart enough to realize that this was a terror attack. And ironically, we had just came back from Israel, and she had broken her ankle in Israel. and pure accident. And we went to the hospital Shomer in Tel Aviv to get it operated on. And ironically, her operation was delayed because there was a terror attack in Israel. So now her ankle wasn't repaired as well as it could have. So now she's trying to escape that area on what basically is a bum ankle. Well, I have a tremendous dilemma because my first thought, honestly, was as a father. My 1.5-year-old son was at home. We had a babysitter for this sort of emergencies, but I didn't want to go in. But I also felt like I had to go in. My place was to be where a New York City detective belonged that day. No one had to call up a New York City cop or fireman or emergency medical service or any other volunteers to say, come in today, we need you. You saw by the horror of that day that you had to be there. But I also did not want to leave my son thinking that if my wife didn't survive, now he's going to lose possibly 2 parents. Well, as it worked out, I found out she was okay as I was about to leave the house, because I did feel like I had to get in. My place was in the city. And thank God she made it out. I got down there. Again, people from New York remember how it felt, how it smelled, how it looked. But especially for people from out of town, the devastation, the vision is undescribable. Words cannot give it justice. The horror of it. And as time progresses, and especially approaching now the 10-year anniversary, is the aspect that, and I'll talk about soon what I experienced in Israel, by having such destruction without body parts, without victims, made no sense. I'm a homicide detective, so I'm used to seeing this. I mean, this is like a surgeon who operates on a regular basis. This is something which you have to have the stomach to do what you're doing. But to not have that connection and only devastation was a vision that no one in their life should ever have to see. And again, I have a very hard time describing it. Well, 2002 comes about, change of administration, and who I consider to be the real builder, commander, or the person who's turned around the NYPD upside down when it comes to terrorism is Commissioner Kelly. Commissioner Kelly did a fabulous job because he realized that we are not supposed to be trained in rescue and recovery. We are supposed to be trained in prevention. Because once the act already happened, it's too late. People are lost. Sure, you want to have people who could climb into the buildings and rescue people out or recover bodies, but most importantly, you want to prevent it. And one of the first things the commissioner did was decide to send detectives overseas. Our first place where he sent a detective was in Toronto. The second place was in Liaison, France. And again, I don't know if I was on the short list or the long list, but my spot was to go to Jerusalem, Israel. Okay, so what was my job when I was sent to Israel? Well, unfortunately, the first thing was to understand suicide bombing, to be able to analyze it, to be able to share back with New York lessons learned, what we could do, A, to prevent, and then, God forbid, recover and rescue. Well, the Israelis became very good at this, which is not really a compliment if you really think about it, because that means it was happening once too often. And they have separate issues they're dealing with in terms of the timing and everything, but if you become very good at doing this kind of work, that means there's a failure in the system that you allow it to happen more than once. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Also, to share with Israel, or actually I like to say exchange information with Israel. So this was, for me, the culmination of my career, because I was able to bring my homicide experience. I was able to bring my investigative experience. I was being able to bring my working with other department experience to Israel. Now, there's one suicide bombing it was actually turned into a regular bombing that I'd like to share with you quickly and just explain why we will not have peace in the very near future. This happened on August 11th at the Calandia Crossing. Now, for anybody familiar with Calandia Crossing, it's the crossing between Ramallah and Jerusalem. If you've never seen a crossing like that, it's basically going through a toll booth, except the toll booth, you're not getting $1 or a ticket. You're being searched. And it is only used, and I repeat, only used by Israeli Arabs and Palestinians. Well, on this particular day, Israel received a warning that there's a suicide bomber heading towards Jerusalem and will most probably use this checkpoint. Now, in the infinite wisdom of the terrorists, they separate the suicide bomber from the explosive device, which means suicide bomber, he might have gone into Israel, maybe not, but he didn't have his explosive device. What did they do? They left it behind. They had somebody separate place the device and activate it remote controlling. Now, you might say, you just said that only Israeli Arabs and Palestinians use this checkpoint. What is he going to accomplish? Well, it turned out 6 border patrolmen, means the Green Police from Israel, were, instead of waiting for the cars to come through the checkpoint, were actually going aggressively. When I say aggressively, instead of waiting for the cars to come, they were approaching each and every car that was online. Well, this evil person decided to explode the device when the policeman got near a car. And the end result, as far as the policemen, 3 of them lost their limbs, and 3 received minor injuries. Horrific from a policeman's perspective, horrific from a Jewish perspective, horrific from every perspective. But the caveat, 2 Palestinians were killed and 17, 18 wounded. So you would say, what normal people would kill their own in order to accomplish an end game like that? Well, they're obviously not normal people, they're evil, and this is how they reacted. Now, what my takeaway was 2 things from this. One is, as a New York City cop, my guys who are working a checkpoint in Atlantic Avenue and in a, let's say, primarily Muslim community are not safe per se from an act of terror, that they will kill their own to accomplish hurting us, meaning the NYPD. But even more importantly, and I hate to say this, was an article from the New York Times. Because my father, God rest in peace, the only thing he taught me was if it wasn't the Times, it had to be true and to vote Democratic. And I have to say both things I've never listened to, so I apologize. Although I was in the New York Times numerous times and no lies were ever said, but I'm not a big fan of it, obviously. I'm just going to read first paragraph and last paragraph of this article. It's by Steve Erlanger, who was a bureau chief at the time, and this basically sums up the issue that we're dealing with, why there will not be peace in our time. Now, let me just give a little more background. Steve Erlanger is interviewing the mother of a 6-year-old Palestinian boy who was critically injured, being worked on at Hadassah Hospital, being treated at Hadassah Hospital, and her father was killed in the same incident. First paragraph, last paragraph. If you go also to the Hadassah website, it's in the Hadassah website, but again, New York Times, Steve Erlanger, August 17th, 2004. Mahdi Abu Sner, the name of the child, 6 years old, lies nearly immobile in a hospital bed on sheets covered with toy trains. He cannot move his legs or his left arm. A breathing tube snakes into his pert nose. His lungs are full of fluid. He has shrapnel close to his spinal cord and his aorta. Any human being in this world will cry. I don't care. This kid's a Martian. It's a horrific thing to think about of any child in this condition. Now the last paragraph. Mirvat, who is his mother, now this is Steve Erlanger interviewing, lifted the blanket from Mahdi's motionless legs and massaged them. Quote, "This is our fate," quote, she said. Quote, "They went to the checkpoint and there was an explosion. I don't know more than that, period. What can I say? Question mark. And this sums up the whole thing. I can't blame anyone. Think about this. Think about this sort of attitude that you cannot place blame on anyone. This is not a normal thinking process. The enemy is not the terrorist. The enemy is the community that cannot blame anyone. The enemy is the community that hangs up pictures of suicide bombers. The enemy is the community that puts up statue of suicide bombers as an icon. The enemy is the ones who teach your children that this is a way to live your life. So that is what we're facing. We're not facing politicians. We're not facing the terrorists. Because let me tell you, as a policeman, we can handle bank robbers, we can handle drug dealers, we can handle the terrorist individual. But what we can't handle is a community that thinks this is a legitimate excuse for anything. Forget about for us being in the West Bank, forget about Gaza, forget about all that think that this is a legitimate way of accomplishing your goal. And as long as they think that way, there will never be peace. Which means you just have to accept that and just try to live the best you can. Now, what I like to sort of end is two things. One is what I see as the role that we, now that I'm retired, of the community that we have to do now. I call it the ABCs of terrorism. First is alertness and awareness. Seeing what's around you, being aware of what's around you, taking everything in. Balance. Balance means, obviously, somebody in Arabic garb you might pay a little more attention to, but not everyone is an active terrorist. Take them as you come, you're going to take it in, but balance, meaning no fear. And three, and this is the hardest, it's conviction. That if, God forbid, something does happen, you cannot stop living your lives. To me, the most important time, fulfillment I got in my life, in terms of my trips to Israel, my time in Israel, now living in Israel, is when Israel is in need. You cannot say, I'm canceling my trip because it's terrorism. You cannot say, I'm canceling my trip because the rockets are flying from Lebanon. You cannot cancel your trip to Sderot because the rockets are flying in from down south. Of course, if we do, and I say this collectively, they win. And I refuse to let them win. The last thing I'd like to just close with is I write in the book about, sort of what I consider to be the effect of all this. Because, even though my kids think I do occasionally put on a cape, I really don't. So the aspect of PTSD that, anyone who's exposed, it could be the effect of day-to-day terror or day-to-day crime. My big takeaway in terms of what I got out of that is that it's very consuming. In other words, there'll never be a normal time again for me in my life. There could be no terror, no nothing. But I also feel very fulfilled on a night like tonight to share these experiences and to just take it through my eyes for one day, for 1 second, and understand this is a part of life. You live with it. Because the second you change a single thing, a single iota, they've won. And I'd like to say thank you very much.
Click subscribe to see more exclusive content for the most sought-after Jewish speakers, teachers, and thinkers.